Good morning. It is Friday, the 21st. We continue looking at the book of Genesis. This morning we have jumped ahead toward the latter part of chapter 11. So we pick up chapter 11, verses 27 through to chapter 12, verse 8. It is the story of Abraham, or the beginning of the story of Abraham, or Abram, as he was known still at that particular time. The portion of scripture that we leave out from where we concluded yesterday, the early part of chapter 11, through to the end of verses 26, is simply the genealogy of how Abram came to be. He is related to Shem. His father was Terah. And interestingly, Shem is, as we said before, the father of the Semites. And these were people who, by and large, were focused on God. Now, this is not to say that every single descendant of Shem from the time of Shem right through till now is entirely Christian oriented. But it is generally a family who have a focus on God. An example is that Terah, the father of Abraham, is an idolater. He worships idols, and in fact he is a tradesman, and he manufactures these idols. Probably the moon god that was worshipped amongst many other gods at that time. And Terah moves from down near the sea, where the Euphrates river empties into the sea, and he moves up to a town called Haran. And both and Haran were known centers of worship of the moon god, and also where the manufacture of these idols took place. And we're not told much about the young Abraham, but reading back into the kind of person he was as we read more about him in his latter years, you realize that he was a man of deep faith. He was a man of conviction. He moved rapidly. For example, when God told him to move, he didn't dally. He said, yes, I'll do that. And you get the sense that almost immediately he packed up his belongings and his people, and he set out for the promised land that God told him to move toward. But also one begins to understand that probably Abram, as he was obviously known as still at that time, his name changed by God was to come later. Here was a man who possibly, having descended from a father who worshipped idols, had nevertheless seen through those idols. Perhaps as scripture puts it, these were idols crafted by human hands, perhaps in the form of a human being, but they had eyes and they could not see. They had a mouth, but it could not speak. They had ears, but it could not hear. It had a nose, but it couldn't breathe. It had arms and legs, but it couldn't move. If it was wood, you threw it in the fire, it would burn up. If it was made of pottery and you dropped it on the floor, it would shatter into pieces. What kind of a God is this? And it doesn't simply represent a God, it becomes the God. Because if you move from one place to the other, you take your household gods with you. Those idols went with you. And Abraham, one assumes, saw through this and realized that his father effectively was on the wrong track. And perhaps he sought after something that was bigger and better. And that God came to him and spoke to him. You get the sense in that conversation that God physically appeared to Abram, and that of course makes it very easy to obey, but nevertheless it is accounted to Abram as righteousness. And there's a sense in which God created all of humankind through Adam. This is symbolized by Adam. God recreated through Noah. And here is God almost recreating again, starting a brand new line of people, now descendant from Abram, not just the Jewish people, but all people who, like Abram, with faith, believe in this God. So we must pause and ask, do you believe in this God? Are you, in that sense, a descendant of Abram? Perhaps not directly, genetically linked to Abram, but because of faith in God. Do you obey God? God may not appear to you in person, but he will speak to you. He will convict you. And he could speak to you directly to yourself or through others. Do you obey him, or do you make excuses? Abraham was credited as being righteous because he He listened to God, he obeyed God, did promptly what God asked him to do. The other significant point, and let me finish on this, is that Abram is married to a woman called Sarai. Her name is also changed to Sarah. That's why we know them as Abraham and Sarah, more famously, but initially Abram and Sarai. And we are told that she is barren. And for me, that is significant because it is saying that these people of God, this new future that God was about to bring about through Abraham and Sarah, was going to happen miraculously, because it wasn't going to be just Abraham and his wife spending a happy time together. This had to have the miraculous intervention of God. You and I, through faith, trace our inheritance back to Abraham. Are you worthy of that inheritance? Do you know God? Do you worship him? And do you worship him and him alone? Have you stepped outside of the way of the world, as Abraham did with his father Terah, and followed God rather than the way of the world? Folks, something quite profound to think about this weekend, and I would encourage you, challenge you even, to think carefully. What is your relationship with God like? Are you obedient? Do you follow him? Is there that miraculous intervention of God in your life? Or do you simply follow the way of the world? Have a wonderful weekend. We'll chat again next week. God bless.